All right, so today we're going to talk about Surah 29, the spider. It's 10:40 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I think Prince is supposed to go on in about 20 minutes. I doubt I'll be able to wrap this up in 20 minutes, but we'll give it a shot. So it begins again with the disjointed letters. Allah, after an invocation of Allah, it says Alif Lam Mim. Again, these things don't really make any sense. Even Islamic scholars aren't able to describe what this is. It's not Arabic. It's not some sort of heavenly tongue or language. There's no real explanation for why these little epigraphs are there, but they're in about a quarter or so of the surahs of the Quran are preceded by these disjointed letters. So the beginning of this surah, it emphasizes the works-based soteriology of Islam. The uh, Supposedly Islam is about belief in Allah and his apostle Muhammad, which itself is problematic because it is associating Muhammad, a man. He's repeatedly described as a man and a warner, i.e., not not a godlike figure, but you also have parts of the Quran and certainly the Hadith which contradict this, which give him the powers and the properties that you would associate with a deity. So it says to believe in Allah and his apostle, and the apostle here is Muhammad. So you're essentially associating Muhammad with Allah, and you're giving fidelity to believing in this man. And this is why when you have blasphemy trials in places like Pakistan and Pakistan or any sort of state which is governed by Sharia, almost always the charges will be blaspheming Muhammad. You'll very rarely find blasphemy trials where they'll lay charges against the person for blaspheming Allah. You see a lot of trials, usually contrived charges against people who are accused of destroying or desecrating the Quran. But usually, when there's a figure that's being blasphemed, it's almost always Muhammad, and those are the charges. You'll very rarely find someone being put on trial for blaspheming Allah. So there's this, but putting that aside, even if you put aside that contradiction, um, there's it's not simply a matter of belief because in the Quran there's no eternal security. Your salvation is always in question, and the only way to assure your salvation is to die a shaheed. So you have to martyr yourself in order to assure yourself a place in paradise, which is why you have an endless struggle and an endless doubt among Muslims. And that's why you have a very works based soteriology, and you have to keep striving. So it's the next verse is, do men ask the question, do men think that they will be left alone on saying we believe and not be tried? And going down to verse 6, it says, and whoever strives hard, he strives only for his own soul. So in other words, the fate of your soul is dependent upon striving and working and trying to achieve in part your own salvation. And this is something that's very similar to almost really every other religion or type of dogma, all of them are based on achieving your own salvation, either in whole or in part. The Buddha's last words were famously, strive unceasingly for your deliverance. And you can contrast this to the last words of Jesus, which were, it is finished. In other words, the atoning sacrifice of Jesus is sufficient. So this is emphasized repeatedly throughout the Quran. And it continues in verse 7, and as for those who believe and do good, we will most certainly do away with their evil deeds, and we will most certainly reward them the best of what they did. And as I pointed out in another video, the deeds, it says that your evil deeds are made good. So there's a very different concept of expiating sin in Islam, where your evil deeds are washed clean. It's not that they're blotted out, that they're that they're uh, that they're um, tossed away, that they're kind of under the blanket of this, under the blanket of Jesus's sacrificial atonement. They're they're turned from evil deeds into good deeds. In other words, they're laundered. And this is a very important concept in Islam, and it's why you see the Islamic paradise. You see people engaging in the most corrupt, perverse, deviant sort of behavior, things that are sins. You see people in Islamic paradise engaging in sins, whereas in heaven there is no sin, because God is perfect, and he can't, and heaven would not be perfect if sin existed inside of this space. So there's no sin. You're even people, the people who die, who've believed in Jesus Christ, their righteousness is imputed to them from Christ. So in other words, since Christ is perfect and is sinless, his righteousness is imputed to you. So there's no sin. But in Islamic heaven, there's lots of sin. But it's not considered sin because Allah has kind of laundered this sin. It's a really bizarre concept, but I think you have to wrap your head around this in order to understand why the Islamic paradise is really a reflection of Muhammad's own carnal desires. So we continue on to verse 10, and it says, and among men is he who says, we believe in Allah, but when he is persecuted in the way of Allah, he thinks the persecution of men to be the chastisement of Allah. And if there come assistance from your Lord, they would most certainly say, surely we are with you. What, is not Allah the best knower of what is in the breasts of mankind? So this is also a recurring theme throughout the Quran. Muhammad trying to use excuse me, trying to use military defeats or setbacks in his plan to take over territory and subjugate Arabian pagan tribes and Jewish tribes, trying to explain defeats and defeats against other forces by invoking the will of Allah. And he's in this verse he's chastising people who are not supporting, or who might who might reconsider supporting Muhammad and his companions by saying they're double-minded. They don't really believe in Allah, because if they were faithful, they would come to his defense, and that they would they wouldn't ever question Muhammad's military leadership. And this is a recurring theme throughout the Quran. This idea that the tactical or strategic defeats are somehow all the will of Allah, and that particularly the defeats are the result of Muhammad's erstwhile followers doubting him and falling back. And it's a very convenient excuse. It's like a Deus ex machina, that whenever something bad befalls him, he can always invoke Allah and saying that he's testing them. But again, there's no real proof that Muhammad is a prophet. There's no real this is the only thing that he can offer, or that Muslims can offer. The fact that there was a rapid growth in Islam from its early oh, hi Love and Light and David and Enoch. Glad you joined us. But this is the only thing that he can really that Muslims can offer in defense of Muhammad's prophethood. The fact that Islam grew incredibly rapidly from the Arabian Peninsula all the way to the borders of Hindustan, or what's known as India now, and Spain, the Mediterranean, the fact that Islam grew rapidly militarily. That's the only thing they can point to justify Muhammad's prophethood. But the thing is, if you believe that that's a sign of a prophet, then Alexander the Great, a pagan king, Alexander of Macedon, was twice or three times the prophet that Muhammad was, because his empire stretched all the way from Greece all the way to India. At the time, it was the greatest empire on the planet. Him and his successors. You could say the Roman Empire was much greater. That the Roman Julius Caesar and Augustus. Augustus established the Pax Romana, whereas there was always internal conflict and external conflict in the Caliphate. There was a peace which existed for a century under Augustus. So you could say that Augustus was a prophet. My point is that this is a really thin reed to base Muhammad's prophethood on, and it's not really biblical. So if we continue to verse 13, again it says, "And most certainly they shall carry their own burdens and other burdens with their own burdens, and most certainly they shall be questioned on the resurrection day as to what they forged." And the preceding verse, it says, "And those who disbelieve say to those who believe, follow our path and we will bear your wrongs, and never shall they be the bearers of their wrongs. Most surely they are liars." And again, this is simply contradicted by Islam. The fact that in that it also says on the day of resurrection that you'll be able to foist your burdens on Jews and on Christians, the historic enemies of Muhammad, is proof that this verse is nonsense. It says they shall well, let's analyze this. It says they shall carry their own burdens and other burdens with their own burdens. So this is referring to those who disbelieve. So in other parts of the Quran, it says it states that you're only able to bear your own burden. That you can't push your burden onto someone else. Now, there are a number of problems with this. In Islam, there's no intercessor, so there's no there's no sacrificial atonement. That Jesus is simply reduced to a sinless man who's not a savior. So even though he has no sin, theoretically, he's not a savior in Islam. So you have to bear all of your own burden and your sin, and you somehow you still might be able to enter paradise dependent upon the will of Allah. But the thing is, but the thing is, right here in verse 13, it says that your sin will be discharged onto unbelievers. So Christians or Jews or people who rejected Muhammad, they'll be able to bear the burdens. But the thing is, this is these verses are mutually incompatible. They contradict each other. You're not. Which is it? Will you be able to bear your own burdens and sin, or will you be able to offload it onto people who are not Muslim? The Quran doesn't really answer this question, and it's just another example of the incoherence of the Quran. I mean, the initial idea itself is kind of ridiculous. The concept that there's no intercessors. We know people who believe have Christ as an intercessor, as someone who imputes his righteousness onto us, but Muslims don't have that, so they have to bear all of their own sins. But right here says there's a loophole. They can take the sins and the burdens of other people, which is simply absurd when you really start to critically analyze this verse. It doesn't make any sense, like much of the Quran. And so it continues, and certainly we sent Noah, i.e. Noah, to his people, so he remained among them 1,000, say 50 years, so 950 years. And the deluge overtook them while they were unjust. So we delivered him and the inmates of the ark and made it a sign of the nations. And this is also kind of interesting, because the description of Noah and Noah's family, they're described as inmates, and this is a motif in the Quran. It describes people who Muhammad visits as inmates of their houses. Now, in that context, it's very likely that it's referring to slaves, because Muslim Muslims had the largest, and even to this day, they continue to have one of the largest slave empires. People who are in bondage. There's the kafala system, which is like a form of indentured servitude, but there's also still slavery practiced in very openly in places like Libya, the Sudan, Mauritania, other Islamic countries, particularly the Gulf Arab states. There are very young boys who are used as camel jockeys in the UAE, and so it could very well refer to slaves, but even here, it refers to the inmates of the ark, the people who are prisoners. Now, the people who were in the ark were delivered from death, which when God sent the flood to efface the entire earth, all of mankind, as well as the animals and the earth itself, was just effaced. But here they're described as inmates. And this is a recurring motif in the Quran, I think, because Islam is very much a slave master relationship. The civilization itself is based around servitude, and Islam, of course, means surrender or submission. In this case, it means submission to Allah, but submission in the sense of a of complete complete bondage. There's no unlike in Christianity, and this is detailed. This is explained very well in Galatians 4, where the relationship of someone who's the son of God is very much a father son relationship. But in Islam, it's the relationship of a master to a master to a slave. So that's just something I thought would be interesting to note. They're described as inmates, and then in 19 it says, "What do they not consider how Allah originates the creation, then reproduces it? Surely that is easy to Allah. Say, travel in the earth and see how He makes the first creation. Then Allah creates the latter creation. Surely Allah has power over all things. He punishes whom He pleases and has mercy on whom He pleases, and to Him you shall be turned back." And this is a biblical concept, another biblical concept that Muhammad has plagiarized. So in Exodus 33:19, it says, "And he said, I shall make my goodness pass before thee, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before thee, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." And this is repeated in Paul's epistle to the Romans. In Romans 9:15, it says, "For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." And subsequently in Romans 9:22, it says, "What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had afore prepared us, prepared unto glory." And this is a response to the question of, and it continues, even us whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. And he saith also in Hosea, "I will call them my people, which were not my people, and her beloved, which was not my beloved." So he's describing the idea of Gentiles being grafted in, and explaining why Jews at during this time, why the majority of them rejected Christ, and trying to um, reconcile this, and explaining this by citing scripture. So this is a biblical concept that Muhammad has purloined, and again is misapplying it to his own for his own purposes. So in verse 26, he starts describing the story of Lot. Very briefly, he says, "And Lot believed in him, and he said, I am fleeing to my Lord. Surely he's the mighty, the wise." And this this is referenced again in the Bible, in the second epistle general of Peter. It says, And uh, in verse 6, it says, "And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that after should live ungodly, and delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked." And in parentheses, it says, "For that righteous man dwelling among them in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deed." And this is kind of a parenthetical thought of Peter describing what Lot was feeling while he was in Sodom. And it's interesting to note here the way the Quran describes Lot, and in fact it calls Lot a prophet. So the Quran esteems Lot a lot more highly than the Bible. Now, in the Bible, in Second Peter, and in the New Testament, he's described as righteous and vexed with their filthy conversation. Vexed with their his soul is described as vexed with their unlawful deeds. But you have to keep in mind he was still a very carnal person, and he was certainly not a prophet. In fact, Lot was continually refusing to obey God. When God told him to come out of Sodom, he he found reasons to temporize and to delay, and he wasn't even able to persuade his sons-in-law to come with him because they thought he was mocking them. That's how poor his testimony was. And he certainly was not, like I said, he was not a prophet in any sense of the word, but in the Quran he's described in these heroic terms to the point where you would confuse him with Abraham, with his cousin. So the Quran paints a very misleading picture, not only of Abraham, who's who's sort of described as a proxy for Muhammad and does the same things that Muhammad does, come into a or goes into a idolatrous pagan place and destroys the pagan idols, except for one pagan idol which he tells people to venerate. And this is sort of a foreshadowing of Muhammad in the context of the Quran. But it also paints a misleading portrait of Lot, of many people, almost every significant biblical figure is described in a misleading way, or distorted in some major way in the Quran. And so in 28, when it says, "And we sent Lot, when he said to his people, most surely you are guilty of an indecency which none of the nations have ever done before you." And this is referencing Genesis without attribution. It's referencing Genesis 19. Oh, sorry. It's referencing Genesis 19, and I'll just read a little bit here. In 6, it says, "And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not do so wickedly." And it describes Lot offering his daughters to the men of Sodom who want to abuse the two angels that were guests of Lot. So it's a reference to that verse when he said, "Most surely you are decency which none of the nations have ever done before you." But there again, there's no context here. It's not describing it's not describing why the indecency of these people is, or what they're guilty of, who they're talking to. They're talking to Lot, but there's no reference to the two angels, which is the fulcrum of this story. They were sent to Sodom in order to essentially as reconnaissance for God to see whether or not the city deserved to be spared, and visiting Lot himself. But there's no reference to this in the Quran, so you have no idea what's happening, or what. Certainly, you have no context, and no way to infer what why Sodom was destroyed, or the specific catalyst for Sodom's destruction. So in 29 continues, what do you come to the males and commit robbery on the highway, and you commit evil deeds in their assemblies? But nothing was the answer of his people, except they said, bring on us Allah's punishment if you are one of the truthful. And again, this is completely nonsensical. He's retconning Islam and his religious belief onto a context where it doesn't fit. These people had no idea who Allah was, because they were not. This was not pagan Arabia. These were uh, these were not people who would be familiar with Allah or the pre-Islamic deities that Muhammad co-opted rather. So it just describes evil deeds in your assemblies and robbery on the highway. Now, again, this could be a conflation of several different things. In the book of Judges, particularly the final chapters in the book of Judges, it describes the state of Israel at the time, which had basically forsaken God, and there was no king in Israel, and there was robbery and plunder, and eventually a civil war itself between with the tribe of Benjamin. So this could actually just be Muhammad again conflating several different narrative strands from the Bible, or it could be a reference to kind of a generic reference to Sodom. We're not sure. So it continues this story in 31. It says, and when our messengers came to Ibrahim with the good news, they said, surely we are going to destroy the people of this town, for its people are unjust. Again, this is a reference to Genesis 19. He said, surely in it is Lot. They said, we know well who is in it. We shall certainly deliver him and his followers, except his wife. She shall be one of those who remain behind. And when our messengers came to Lot, he was grieved on account of them, and he felt powerless to protect them. And they said, fear not, nor grieve. Surely we will deliver you and your followers, except your wife. She shall be of those who remain behind. Surely we will cause to come down upon the people of this town a punishment from heaven, because they transgressed, and certainly we will have left a clear sign of it for people who understand. And again, this is a misrepresentation of what happened. It's describing Lot's wife as having been punished, having been foreordained to die, which is not what happened. Lot's wife was punished because she couldn't leave behind Sodom, and she looked behind her to see what was happening, the destruction of her city, of the city in which they lived, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. She was destroyed, basically, and her life was taken. But it wasn't something that was predestined to happen It was she chose to look back and suffer the consequences of that decision. So in 39, it continues on a different strand. It says, "And we destroyed," and it repeats this repeatedly. We destroyed. We sent Karun, i.e., Korah, the sons of Korah, and Pharaoh and Haman, and certainly Musa came to them with clear arguments, but they behaved hastily in the land, yet they could not outstrip us. And as I mentioned in my previous video, Haman, the um, vizier to King Ahasuerus in Persia, is inserted into the biblical narrative of Exodus in the Quran. Muhammad takes this person who is the central antagonist in the book of Esther and transposes him onto to Exodus and the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh. So Haman is described as a servant of Pharaoh, and this just illustrates once again the incoherency of the Quran, the anachronisms which riddle this book. If you really sit down and read the Quran, it's just replete with all sorts of anachronisms and inconsistencies and different biblical figures inserted into different time periods and conflated. And this is just another example of that. So in 41, it describes a quote unquote parable. It says the parable of those who take guardians besides Allah is as the parable of the spider that makes for itself a house, and most surely the frailest of the houses is the spider's house. Did they but know? And again, this is not an example of a parable. It's just something inserted there to militate against the idea of a trinity. Muhammad just continually inveighs against the deity of Christ and the triune nature of God. And this is one example. He takes he takes something that's described as a parable, which really isn't a parable, because Muhammad did not understand what a parable was, and drops it here in order to um, inveigh against Christianity and the idea of a trinity. Surely Allah knows what everything they call upon besides him, and he is the mighty, the wise. And as for these examples, we set them forth for men, and none understand them but the learned. And this is ironic considering we just went through a completely incoherent, I wouldn't even call it a narrative, but just uh, a very disjointed story that's cribbed from the Bible, but in such a manner that it makes absolutely no sense. It's devoid of context. The spider's house is one of the strongest quote unquote houses. And this is of course where the title of the surah comes from. The the title comes from a paragraph long passage in the chapter that makes absolutely no sense and is described as a parable, even though it's not really a parable. The the and it doesn't even make sense from a logical level if you separate yourself from this context. That the spiders a spider web is not it's not the frailest of houses. It's actually pretty durable. I mean, it, if he's referring here to a spider's web, it's actually very resilient and elaborately constructed. If you've ever looked at a spider's web and the how intricate weaved it is. It's one of the most beautiful things. And I'm not talking about like a tiny the type of spider's web you see at sometimes if you go down to the basement your basement and like did kind of that's that kind of blows away in a wisp of but an actual spider's web. If you've ever watched one of those nature documentaries or BBC documentaries done narrated by David Attenborough, a spider's web is actually very it's kind of remarkable when you look at it. Uh, for a spider, yes, but walking through it in the dark, it's not. Well, yeah, it's not beautiful if you walk through it, but um, the point is, it's not frail at all. I mean, this is one of the reasons. If you've ever seen one of these documentaries and you've watched an insect get caught inside of a spider's web, it's virtually impossible. Very rarely will they ever actually escape or manage to escape before the spider has consumed them. So, like even taking this taking apart this little passage, which really isn't significant. Even dissecting it logically, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The parable is not a parable. It does even putting that aside, it doesn't make any sense. What he's saying is just flatly contradicted by observation, simple observation. So in 46, it continues, and do not dispute with the followers of the book except by what is best. And here he's talking about Christians and Jews who presumably reject Muhammad and are skeptical of his message. He says, except those of them who act unjustly and say, we believe in that which has been revealed to us and revealed to you, and our God and your God is one, and to him do we submit. And it continues in 47, and thus have we revealed the book to you, so those whom we have given the book believe in it, and of these are those who believe in it, and none deny our communications except the unbelievers. And you did not recite before it any book, nor did you transcribe one with your right hand. For then could those who say untrue things have doubted. Nay, these are clear communications in the hearts of those who are granted knowledge, and none deny our communications except the unjust. Now, there are a number of problems with this passage. Beginning with the fact that it says it doesn't even imply. It states clearly here, our God and your God is one. In other words, there's no difference between the Islamic God and the God worshipped by Jews and Christians. And this is reified by a hadith where Muhammad places the Torah and the gospel on a cushion and points to them in chiding Muslims who are asking him about this. This is one of the clearest illustrations of how the Quran does not make any sense, because as David Wood has pointed out, you can either believe in the Quran or disbelieve in the Quran, but either way, the Quran is not coherent, because either you believe in the Quran and you say the gospel and the Torah are true, and it's in other words, the gospel and the Torah are true, and if you agree with that statement, then the Quran is false, because the gospel and the Torah contradict the Quran, or you disagree with this part of the Quran, and in that case, the Quran is still false because it's part of the Quran says something that is simply not true. So in either way, Muslims are in a bind. They either have to believe in the Quran, in which case the Quran is false, or they disbelieve at least part of the Quran, and in that case, the Quran is still false. So it doesn't make any sense when you look at it logically. And secondly, the God of the Quran, the God of Muhammad, is obviously not the same God as the God of Elijah and the God of Saul, the God of Peter and Jesus's apostles. The triune God is not the same God as the God of the Quran, which repeatedly emphasizes that he's not triune, he's not part of a trinity, even though Muhammad did not really understand what the Trinity was. Uh, these are not the same God. And Nabil Qureshi wrote a great apologetics text entitled No God But One, where he explored the differences between the Islamic God and the God worshipped by Christians. And his conclusion was these were two completely separate gods. You could not accept the God outlined in the Quran and still claim that this God was the same God worshipped by Christians. And even here, he exposes the ignorance. He exposes his own ignorance by claiming that the Christians now, i.e., contemporaneous with Muhammad, that existed in the 7th century, these Christians were not really the same as the disciples of Christ, and they believed in completely different things. And you have to ask yourself the question, who knew better Jesus Christ and his message, his followers or Muhammad, who was born in the 7th century, who really didn't have any serious knowledge of the gospel, didn't read the gospel, didn't read the Pauline epistles, didn't read the book of Revelation, and whose impression of Christianity was formed by heretics and it was formed by heretical sects, the Nestorians, Gnostic influences. Does this person know the gospel, know the message of Jesus better than the people who follow Jesus and sacrificed their lives for Jesus, the early apostles and his disciples? And the answer is obviously no. The manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts for New Testament books, the Gospels, the Pauline epistles, these are all dated to within a century or less of Jesus's death, depending upon whether you want to use more conservative or less conservative scholarship in terms of dating things like First Corinthians, which one of the earliest was one of the earliest books of the New Testament in terms of chronologically, or things like the Epistle to the Galatians, or even books like Mark and Luke. Even these are now believed to be relatively shortly within a generation or so of Jesus's crucifixion, dated to within about a generation of his crucifixion or less. And even the Book of John, which is the um, these are all things that were created, that were written relatively quickly in terms of history. When we're looking at ancient texts, with anything within a century or so is is considered authentic, and we have thousands of manuscripts of copies of the Gospels. It's one of the most amply documented and authenticated texts, ancient texts, unlike the Quran, which was created over a century, long after Muhammad had died, and was repeatedly changed and altered, and not in a minor way in terms of variations in spelling like we have with the Gospels and most of the New Testament. Minor variations in terms of transcription. The Quran has deep changes and alterations. So you have to consider this when Muhammad is accusing the Christians of the time of altering or changing the doctrine of Jesus. He's simply not a reliable witness. He's not a reliable source. He wasn't a witness at all. He he's he his impression of Christianity was influenced by heretics and people who had very bad doctrine, and that is how he came to know co- the concepts that he did in terms of the Bible, the Torah. This is why you have so many parts of the Quran that are really Talmudic stories, legends, and interpretations, uh, the Mishnah, things that really aren't biblically sound, but would sound correct to Muhammad, who had no understanding of the difference between the Talmud and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books written by Moses. So you have to keep this in mind when you have Muhammad accusing Christians of departing from the teachings of Jesus Christ. So in 55, it continues on the day 54 rather. Then they ask you to hasten on the chastisement, and most surely hell encompasses the believers. On the day when the chastisement shall cover them from above them and from beneath their feet, and he shall say, taste what you did. And this is just another indication of how sadistic Allah is. This is repeated throughout the Quran, how Allah enjoys torturing people, and in contrast to God, who takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, we have an Islamic God that actually enjoys torturing and tormenting people, and does take pleasure in the death of the wicked and their torment, which should be one of the main indications that he's not really God, that this is not the God. This idea of people uh, p- people asking to hasten the chastisement. I'm not sure exactly where this comes from, but there is um, an idea, particularly in Israel before the, their exile, and before Israel was taken into captivity first by Assyria, and then the southern kingdom Judah was taken into captivity by by the Babylonians, and the temple was destroyed. There, there is there were people who were looking for the day of the Lord, and were not aware of the fact that they were going to come under judgment. Particularly, we're talking here about Israel itself. But again, Muhammad did not have a real grasp of hermeneutics. He didn't understand. He didn't understand the Bible, the Torah, or the Gospel. So when you're dealing with these concepts, it's hard to know how much of this Muhammad was actually aware of. It says in 62, 61, it says, and if you ask them who created the heavens and the earth and made the sun and the moon subservient, they will certainly say Allah. Whence are they then turned away? Allah makes abundant the means of subsistence for whom he pleases of his servants and straightens them for whom he pleases. Surely Allah is cognizant of all things. Again, this is flatly contradicted by many verses in the Quran where it demonstrates the limited knowledge of Allah, the fact that he is not omniscient. He doesn't know what his servants are doing. And even in the hadith, you get the impression that Allah is very circumscribed in his knowledge. And in 65, it says, so when they ride in the ships, they call upon Allah, being sincerely obedient to him. But when he brings them safe to the land, lo, they associate others, in parentheses, with him. And again, this is a criticism of excuse me. This is a criticism of Trinitarian Christianity. Excuse me. Sorry. And it is a concept that people who are familiar with the Bible would be familiar with, but it's expressed so much more beautifully in the Bible, specifically in Psalm 107. It's a great description of people relying upon or resorting to God in extremis. When they're under immense pressure, they call out to God. And this is reiterated particularly in the book of Jonah, when Jonah is swallowed and immured in this tomb and calls out and prays to God, even though up to that heretofore he'd rejected God and rejected his command to go out and prophesy to the people of Nineveh. But in Psalm 107, it's just such a beautiful illustration of this concept. I'd like to read a little bit of it. In verse 15, it says, "Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. For he hath broken the gates of brass and cut the bars of iron in sunder. Fools, because of their transgression and because of their iniquities, are afflicted. Their soul abhorreth all manner of meat, and they draw near unto the gates of death. Then they cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and he saveth them out of their distresses. He sent his word and healed them, and delivered them from their destructions. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men, and let them sacrifice the sacrifices of thanksgiving, and declare his works with rejoicing. They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down again to the depths. Their soul is melted because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunkard man, and are at their wits' end. Then they cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distresses. He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still. Then are they glad because they be quiet, so he bringeth them unto their desired haven. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. Let them exalt him also in the congregation of the people, and praise him in the assembly of elders. And this is a much better illustration of this concept than what you have in the Quran, which describes people who are disobedient to Allah. In other words, people who reject Muhammad and reject his very confused, very bizarre message. They're somehow equated to people who reject God. But I would just recommend for Muslims, to read Psalm 107, to read the Psalms in general, and they get a much better understanding of who God is, His nature, than they would just by reading the Quran. And in 68, it continues. Excuse me. And who is more unjust than one who forges a lie against Allah, or gives the lie to the truth when it has come to him? Will not in hell be the abode of the unbelievers? And this is a great verse to look at and compare to. I agree, the true word of God is so wonderful. I agree with that. But this is a good verse to contrast with other parts of the Quran where it says, and who is more unjust than one who forges a lie against Allah? So if you compare this to Surah 354, where it says, and they planned, and Allah also planned, and Allah is the best. Excuse me. Allah is the best of. And here in my copy it says planners, but the actual word translated is deceiver. So in Surah 354, it says Allah is the best of planners in my translation, but the actual word is deceivers. So it says also in Surah 8:30. In 8:30 it says Allah too had arranged a plan, and Allah is the best of planners. But it really means deceivers. The Arabic word is makir, and Muslim apologists like to say that this is a distortion by Christian apologists and missionaries. That makir is a word that has several meanings, or several not necessarily meanings, but several different different inflections. So you could say planner if it's Allah, but for people who are planning against Allah, they're really schemers. And what the Quran is saying is Allah is a great planner, someone who plans the undoing of these people who are scheming against Him. But the problem is, this is very useful for a Muslim apologist and for Muslim in general to use to get around the idea of Allah deceiving people. Now, in the Bible, God does not deceive people. He very clearly it's said God is someone who cannot lie. It's impossible. It goes against the fundamental character of God for him to lie. But in the Quran, it says Allah is the best of deceivers. So here where it says, and who is more unjust than the one who forges a lie against Allah, it's sort of it's sort of too simple to say that people are scheming against Allah, and then therefore Allah is planning their undoing. What Allah is actually doing is deceiving people, and one of the greatest deceptions of Allah is the idea that He exists as God. Muhammad, and is not simply a proxy for Muhammad to enact his policies and to engage in the type of behavior that would be forbidden if he actually would submit himself to the real God. The Arabic word is emphatic, not ambiguous. Deceiver, used over 5 times in the Quran. In every instance is negative. Yeah, this is something that Muslims have a hard time. So that they'll rely on the fact that the people who try to explain this to non-Muslims a lot of times don't know Arabic, so they'll insist that their knowledge of Arabic somehow makes them a better arbiter of what these verses say. But it's repeated throughout the Quran, How about plotter? Yeah, it's I think the word itself, "macker," is this is the source of the confusion because this is where it stems from. But Muslims are actually trying to sow confusion, and this when you look at the Quran, like I said in verses 354 and 830, like I said in my translation, it says planner, but this was a this is the translation by M.H. Shakir, and this was published by a a company in the U.S. which was essentially a North American branch or division of the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is a book that goes out of its way to downplay problematic aspects of the Quran. But the actual verse, when you really look at it, it 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 says deceiver in the sense of someone who deceives or someone who schemes or plots. It has a distinctly negative connotation because most people, particularly when you have read the Bible and you have an understanding of God's nature, God is not someone who schemes or deceives or lies. It's impossible for him to lie or mislead people. There are people that are misled because of their own misconception of who God is, and they go deeper and deeper into sin and false doctrine because of their own desires and misunderstandings or misconceptions about God. But God is not uh, someone who's there to deceive people. But in the Quran, God is Allah, who Muslims believe to be God, is deceiving people continually. So when it says here, "Who is more unjust than one who forges a lie against Allah?" The lie he's referring to is belief in the triune God and the deity of Christ. So in other words, he's citing something that's true as an example of a lie. And this is why you can't really trust the Quran. And I'll just wrap up. This is the last verse of the surah. It says, "And as for those who strive hard for us, we will most certainly guide them in our ways and in our ways." Again, the plural pronoun is used, indicating that there's a multiplicity of persons in the Godhead, even though this is something that's denied repeatedly throughout the Quran. And Allah is most surely with the doers of good. So that's a good verse to end on, uh, as an illustration of this chapter, which emphasizes some of the faulty foundations of Islam, the idea of a works based soteriology and a salvation that necessitates continually striving, but also a completely distorted image of God. And Love and Light says that's exactly right. That's exactly why we have to show Muslims the truth in Jesus Christ because they are victims of the ideology. Yeah, it's sad how many Muslims are being led astray. When people say Islam is a death cult, it is in a literal sense in many cases, but also in a spiritual sense because these people are being led to their death and they need to be saved. And one of the ways that they're saved is by people lovingly leading them to the knowledge of truth, to pointing them in direction of Christ. And that's it for Surah 29, the spider. The next video will be on the Romans, Surah 30. Sorry for the sniffles and sneezing. I have allergies, obviously. Love Muslims and reject Islam. That's a great note to end on. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Um, Share this video. Like I said, if you like this series, be sure to share it with other people, particularly Muslims who are curious, who are questioning. And thanks for joining us, Tony, John. Love and Light, Enoch, David, GW. I'll see you next time.